Good morning, everybody. My name is Dr. Tami DeCoteau. I just want to start by acknowledging that the place where I stand today is the Indigenous land of the Dene people. And I'm very grateful to be here today. I'm very grateful to have an invitation to stand before you and speak about trauma and trauma-informed care and healing. I just want to take a little moment to introduce myself. I am a member of both the Navajo Nation and the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. My enrolled tribe is Mandan Hidatsa Navajo Nation, and on my grandfather's side, we are Turtle Mountain Chippewa. So, as you know, tribal enrollment is not the whole story, and we often have multiple tribes that we are connected with. Outside of work, I am mom to 6 boys. Yes, they are busy and dirty and smelly, but they keep me busy and they are so much joy. I apologize, I cannot be here for the full day tomorrow. I have to get back for their wrestling matches and their band performances and what have you, so I will only be here for the first couple hours tomorrow. I want to tell you that on my father's side, I'm Native American, but on my mother's side, I am German. And I always say that from my mother, I learned the great virtue of work ethic. And not just any kind of work ethic, but for those of you who have German lineage, German work ethic. And you know what that means, that you work in spite of any physical pain or ailment and ignore all bodily sensations. But my father really taught me the power of prayer. And he helped me to understand that even though my earliest memories of my own Native family are of waking up to uncles and aunties sobering up on the couch or being pulled out of bed in the middle of the night because we had to drive across the state to bail somebody out of jail, that's not who we are. That those types of behaviors were symptoms of something that had happened to us. And so I think it's really important for us to remember that historical trauma is not our history. It's the thing that happened to us that interrupted our history. Trauma is in our DNA, but it's not our identity. It's the thing that has disconnected some of us from our identity. And some of our families and our relatives have had a difficult time finding their way back to wellness. So I'm not here today to tell you what you need to do and how to heal your own people. I'm here today to remind you that you already know how, and that the methods of healing are very, very much present and alive in our cultural ways. And to inspire you, as I'm talking today about modern day psychological practices and research, to inspire you to be thinking about the similarities between what I'm talking about and your cultural ways. Because every single tribal community that I go to has cultural practices that parallel the things that I'm talking about. And that is true in my own tribe. It's part of the reason I'm so passionate about the trauma research these days, is because what research is showing us is that it's the rhythmic patterned movements and sounds and relational connections and multiple attachments that resynchronize our system when it's become chaos because of trauma. And what the research is saying is that those things are the indigenous practices. There are drums and our sounds and our dances, and so what people used to disregard as silliness, as nonsense, now is being found in our research practice as evidence-based practices for healing trauma. And we already knew that, but it's validating to hear that. So I want to inspire you to be thinking creatively about what are those things in your own community that could be brought forward to use in a healing model for your people. So I just want to start by talking a little bit about, well, what is trauma? You know, we have these clinical diagnoses and we hear terms like post-traumatic stress disorder and stress-related disorders, and those are really things that that the field of mental health has created so that we can communicate, but they require practitioners like myself to evaluate somebody and determine that you have a certain number of symptoms that fit into a certain category in order to meet a diagnosis and bill for insurance, right? But that doesn't really tell us about, well, what is it and how does the person experience it and what do trauma behaviors look like? What we know through research is that there's 6 primary risk factors for trauma. And that trauma really is anything that overwhelms your ability to respond to stress or cope with stress. And that can be different for each one of us. Some of us cope really well with certain things, but not so well with other things. So anything that overwhelms your ability to cope is considered a stressor, or a toxic stressor, or a traumatic stressor. We have to remember that unless we have the opportunity to process out our stress, our body remembers everything, and it stays within us. So even though that some of us might be very good at suppressing or ignoring or avoiding, it's still within our bodies and creates disease and unwellness until we utilize practices to process that out. And I know and I believe from my stories from my elders that we had those ways that we were in our cultures. We were always processing back to health, and so we had ways to keep us well, even though we were being exposed to trauma in our traditional ways. But science tells us there's 6 primary risk factors. And we often don't think of that because we think of traumatic incidents of like abuse and neglect or life-threatening issues, those kinds of things. But this is the stuff that my aunties and my grandmas told me when I was pregnant with my babies, that don't be around negative people. Avoid stressful situations, because what you feel, your baby feels. And what the energy that you expose yourself to, you expose your baby to. And we know that's true from science, that if a mother is in an abusive relationship, if she doesn't have adequate support, if it's an unplanned pregnancy, what have you, and she's experiencing high levels of stress hormones, while the baby and the unborn baby is developing in her womb, that baby is feeling what mom's feeling and is exposed to those high levels of stress hormones that actually create neurological and chemical changes in the baby that can last throughout the baby's lifespan. So trauma starts even before birth. Prenatal substance exposure, it's estimated that about 8 out of 10 children in the foster care system have been exposed in utero to substances. As a clinician who works primarily with children in the foster care system, I will tell you my experience is it's higher than this. It's much closer to 100%. Think about it. Why do children get into the foster care system? Almost always because they have a substance abusing caregiver that does not have the ability to take care of them. And so the foster care system really ought to be a substance abuse treatment program for families. What we often think of as fetal alcohol syndrome, what's happening is so many infants are being born with this exposure, and unless a mother uses specifically during this brief period of time where facial features are developing, you won't see the obvious features of a fetal alcohol child. They'll look like a typical child. Polysubstance exposed, meth exposed, these other types of drugs, they don't cause deformities in facial features or body. And so these children look like typical children. And we're not catching them in our medical system. And what happens is they don't function like normal children because they have impairments in their brain development, how their nervous system and the neurochemistry in the body works. And what I typically see with these children is they have some struggles, but they do kind of okay, even though there's some delays, they kind of move along okay until about the time that they get to adolescence. They don't have the brain capacity to manage the onset of teenage hormones, and then we see those children really disrupt. And you can see that in terms of functioning, they're not functioning like a typical child, but we don't catch them in the system because we don't have the resources or what have you to really address this issue. Birth trauma, early hospitalizations, when the child comes through the womb, if it's a traumatic experience, if it's a difficult delivery, if forceps or suction is used, there can be little microscopic bruises or lesions in the baby's brain that can have long-lasting effects on how they function in early childhood and perhaps even throughout life. Early hospitalizations means separation from their caregiver. And in fact, this is research that was done decades ago, 1950s and 1960s, and even earlier that, where psychologists were trying to understand what was the common link between all these young people that were in juvenile detention. And what they found was that every single one of them had a history of an early separation. Either they were abandoned, or mom got sick and had to be in the hospital, or their caregiver passed away, or they were hospitalized. And what they started to realize was that that early separation leads to some sort of psychological problem that ultimately makes these children at high risk for involvement in the judicial system. And this is actually the research that changed the policies in the hospitals. Some of you who are my age or older might remember there was a time that even if you had a child in the hospital that was terminally ill, you could not visit them unless it was visiting hours. And there were no exceptions. And this is the research that changed that policy, because we now know that having safe, loving attachments, caregivers available while a child is in the hospital leads to better outcomes. Children get better faster, and the rates of death are much, much lower. Of course, abuse, physical, emotional abuse, abuse of any kind is considered a risk factor of trauma. And we often think about abuse as like the most harmful or more harmful than neglect. And really, in many ways, neglect is even more harmful, because abuse sends the message to a child, I don't like you. But neglect sends the message, you don't matter, which can have an even much deeper impact on their self-confidence and their self-concept and their identity development throughout their lifespan. And then there are, of course, things like traumatic incidents, exposure to violence, disaster, separations, and multiple placements. We often don't think of this, but even when children are removed from an abusive home, and sometimes that has to happen for the safety of the child, but when we remove them, not only do we think about, well, we get them to safety, but we take them away from the things that are familiar to them. We take them away from the perhaps the safety of their pet and their neighborhood friends, and the attachment they have with their teachers and their school system and maybe doctors and what have you, aunties and uncles and grandpas and grandmas. Every single time we move a child in the foster care system, we create another trauma for them. And so for those of you working in child welfare, I want you to be thinking about that. When we have to move children, we want to minimize maintain as many attachments as possible and minimize the number of transitions, because every move is harmful. So I want to talk to you about trauma in these terms, because these are the terms that we use in the field of trauma. When we talk about big T trauma, big T traumas are the things that I just listed, things that are life-threatening, that have these impact, that are detrimental to the brain and the body and so forth. But little T traumas are things that are highly stressful to you, that maybe recur repeatedly or maybe even once over a period of time, and they accumulate, they compound in the body. And they begin to present just like a big T trauma. So there are things like, well, maybe you grew up in a home where you didn't have any of those big T traumas, but you're always called stupid, or you always made to feel like you were less, or maybe you were bullied in school, or maybe you didn't have shoes that fit, or clothes that fit. And it was really distressing. And those things, again, get stored in the body, and I'm going to talk about how that happens a little bit later. And they compound. Anything that we don't have a chance to process out gets stored in the body. And we'll build and build and build in the neural network until we have a response to it, just like a post-traumatic stress response. So if you find yourself saying things like, I keep having this reaction to this incident, and every time these things happen, I overreact. And my rational brain says it's no big deal, but I can't stop myself from reacting. It's so stupid. It's probably related to a little T trauma. And I have a lot of people that come into my office and say, but this wasn't a trauma at all. I don't know why I'm acting this way. Because it's compounded over time to create a big T trauma. Complex developmental trauma is a really important term that I want you to remember. Because what it means is that a child has been exposed to multiple types of trauma over their developmental lifespan. So maybe they had drug exposure in utero, and then at birth they ended up in the foster care system, and then throughout their childhood they maybe had 8 to 12 placement moves, and experienced some sexual abuse and maybe some physical and emotional abuse and what have you. So there's multiple types of trauma throughout their developmental lifespan, between in utero, prenatal to 18. This is a time, a really critical time, where the child's brain is growing rapidly. And they're developing neurons and neural pathways based on their life experiences that will help their body understand how to respond to the environment and how to comprehend the world around them. And when those traumas occur throughout those developmental stages, it impacts the way the brain and the body development happens, and that has long-lasting impact and makes long-lasting changes for that child throughout their lifespan. So I like to talk about it like this. If I see a child in my office that has no history of trauma, comes from an intact family, but they're presenting with symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they have one piece of their pie that's impaired, just one, and all other pieces are okay, their prognosis is good because they can compensate with all these other areas. When I see a child with complex developmental trauma, all developmental levels are impaired. 100% of the pie is impacted. They're lucky if one slice of the pie is intact. So that means that we're not just talking about psychological and emotional issues, but we're talking about developmental delays, learning disabilities, motor and coordination issues, sensory integration problems. 9 out of 10 children with complex developmental trauma, 9 out of 10, 90%, have sensory integration problems. That's the brain's ability to take in all of the information in our environment, organize it, and tell us what to do about it. With sensory integration, the brain takes in all of the information, and it's like traffic jam. And what that looks like is a behavioral meltdown. All the time I get referrals for kids that have diagnosis of a disruptive behavior disorder, and it's not behavioral at all. They're having sensory processing issues. This is occupational therapy, physical therapy stuff. So because the impact is so broad, then the intervention must be broad as well. These are not children who will benefit from mental health services alone. They must have educational supports and relational interventions and medical interventions and occupational and physical therapy interventions. So when you see a child that has diagnoses that look like ADHD, disruptive behavior disorder, some kind of mood disorder, maybe conduct disorder, and the list goes on and on. There's like this list of diagnoses, and if you ask 3 different clinicians, they'll give you 3 different answers. When you see that, think complex developmental disorder, and that you're dealing with a child that has this broad impact and they need broad intervention. Does that make sense? Okay, we don't have a diagnostic term for this, so you won't see it diagnosed, but it's a real thing. Relational trauma refers to when somebody was supposed to care for a child, when that person was supposed to be their trusted caregiver, their safe person, but that person was the person who harmed them. That's relational trauma. We have a system in us that makes us feel safe and secure. It's called the attachment brain. And when we feel afraid, our nervous system tells us to go to our safe person. One of my children, when he was a toddler, he used to startle real easily, and he'd hear a loud noise, and he'd grab onto my leg, and he'd go, "My mommy." Because his nervous system just said, find your attachment. That's your safe person, right? That's supposed to happen. But if a child's safe person is also the person that harms him, then the attachment brain doesn't develop properly. And what happens with those children is they become unable to understand relationships and nonverbal cues and how to function and above all, how to feel safe in relationships. They desperately want relationships. They need them just like any other person, but they can't feel safe. So as soon as they start to get close to a person, especially a parent or a guardian or a caregiver that has authority over them, as soon as they start to build an attachment, this little alarm goes off in their system that says people aren't safe. And so they'll sabotage that relationship. So with these individuals, you get this push-pull, I need you, but get away from me. That's very confusing in the attachment. And they will hyper-control every single thing about the relationship because the only way they can feel safe is to be the boss of that relationship. And so what we get from these individuals is manipulation and lying and control and power and abuse. And what they're trying to do is establish a sense of safety in relationships. Relationship trauma can only be healed by relational interventions, not by behavioral interventions. We get into trouble when we use behavior modification with these individuals because it'll actually backfire and we cause more harm. So we have to understand that we must use a relational intervention with people who have relational trauma. And what do the statistics say about children who have been abused? Who abuses them? Somebody they know. The majority of children who experience abuse are abused by somebody they know. So the majority of children who have trauma are traumatized by a family member. So historical trauma refers to the cumulative psychological and emotional wounding that a group of people have suffered because of a history of genocide or a mass traumatic event. And so for us Native people, that is our history of genocide, the government policies that sought to terminate an entire race of people. And we all know what those things are to some extent. But what happens is that trauma gets remembered in the bodies, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically about how this happens. And it actually impacts how our DNA codes, what messages get turned on and turned off in the DNA. And our body actually has its own cellular or somatic memory. So beyond what we can remember in terms of our brain, the pictures in our head that we have of our past, we have a somatic memory. And our epigenetics research, the most recent research, is now showing us that somatic memory can span 14 generations. Wow, that's like 1,000 years of somatic memory that we have inherited. So somatic memory is like this. I have an adult patient that I work with who has a vomiting phobia, no history of trauma whatsoever, really comes from a good, intact family. Haven't been able to identify little t traumas, but she has this reaction. It's very phobic. It causes problems for her when her children are sick. This could be an inherited somatic trauma, right? Because what's happening is when she's exposed to the stimuli, the thing that makes her anxious, her body tells her to respond with fear, even though she has no history of trauma that could be identified as related. That could be a somatic memory of somebody in her lineage that had a reaction, that perhaps there was poisoning, or I'm just sort of making stuff up here, but the body remembers it and could react. So some of what we deal with isn't about what happened to us in our lifetime, it's about what happened to somebody in our ancestry. And if they didn't heal that, if that wasn't processed out, that could have been handed down intergenerationally. We know this is true as Indian people, right? This is the stuff our ancestors tell us about, that we carry some of their energy, some of who they are within us. And as Indian people, we probably all feel that in trauma terms. Sometimes you feel like you're carrying somebody else's trauma, not just your own. But we're not just trauma DNA, we're also strength and resiliency DNA. People often say to me, Indian people didn't industrialize, or they didn't have math, or they didn't have medical doctors. They sure did, right? You don't survive in the desert or the winters of North Dakota without being an engineer and an architect and a scientist and knowing how to construct safe and warm and portable housing, right? And knowing how to have medicine from the earth and understanding how the body works in order to use ceremony for healing. They were all of those things. It was just a different perspective. And so people think they didn't have that, but they did. And they really knew more than what we know today. So transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma is the passing on of the trauma behaviors generation after generation after generation. So those are the things that we see in our community today that we struggle with, like substance abuse and violent and these difficulties that we have that are passed on generation to generation through behaviors. That's intergenerational trauma. So this is the ACEs diagram, or the pyramid. We're very familiar with this now, right? The ACEs research is telling us that the more traumatic incidents, stressful incidents that you had as a child, the more likely you are to have chronic disease and early death later in life. What we know from that is what happens is that exposure to these things creates high levels of stress hormones. High levels of stress hormones over a period of time creates inflammation in the body that leads to disease, right? Like 80% of disease is related to inflammation. It also leads to behaviors like substance abuse and other types of behaviors that put us at risk. So on the left is what the pyramid looks like for the general population. And on the right is what the pyramid looks like for the native population, because not only do we have all of the same things that they have over here, but we also have the social conditions and the context of which we have survived in and currently live in, and then the generational and historical trauma. So we don't have ACEs data yet. I know there are some entities that are trying to collect it. I believe that you were given an ACEs form today. We're going to hand it out later. It's a 10 question questionnaire that you mark yes or no of whether or not you've had an event. It's totally anonymous. We don't want to know who you are when you put your marks on these. And then there's a question at the end that says, basically, is there anything else that you feel like was traumatic that we haven't asked you about? And that's the addition that we added, because we want to know for you guys, what are these last two levels? What is that for you? And there's no right or wrong answer. What we're going to do with that information is we're going to analyze it, and we're going to present it at our next Warrior Spirit conference. So nobody will be identified. It will be presented anonymously as, here's what the attendees' ACEs looked like. X percent of them had 6 or more, this percentage had all 10. Here are the themes that came out that are not listed. What we're trying to move towards is, what does an ACEs measure for Native Americans look like? What is trauma to the person who's experienced trauma? If it's betrayal, feels like betrayal in their own lives. It's violence. To them, it's unbearable. It's not tolerable. It feels totally out of their control. And Trauma has not just a direct impact on the person who experienced the traumatic event, but trauma impacts everybody around the traumatized person. So I always say, as Indian people, if you don't have your own personal history of trauma, you're still impacted. You're impacted by our historical trauma, and you're impacted by the secondary effects of our people around us, right? And so when there's a person who suffers from trauma in a family system, all members of the family are impacted by their trauma. And we call that secondary or vicarious trauma. And it also leaves an imprint, not just in our brains, but in our bodies and perhaps in our spirits as well. So the traces of trauma remain in our biology for generations after generations, unless we heal it and process it out. Because what trauma can change in our systems that causes dysfunction, we can also change in our systems to create wellness and health. So trauma can literally create your nervous system to be chaotic and dysfunctional, and then you can have a child that inherited your dysfunctional nervous system and now has anxiety and panic and emotional issues, and that child doesn't have any history of trauma. But if we heal ourselves, then we begin to stop that cycle of passing those things on, because we get to process out and we acknowledge not just our own trauma, but the trauma of the people who came before us. I so often hear, what happened to Indian people wasn't genocide. It was a war that you guys lost. Get over it. Move on. I don't agree with any of those things, and I'm sure you don't either. But the point is, you don't get over trauma. It doesn't happen that way. You can suppress it, you can avoid it, you can dissociate from it, but your body will tell the story. The body will tell the story in the form of illness and disease and bodily functions that break down, and it eventually will come out in harmful ways. The body remembers everything. We even sense threat when we're not conscious. So when I'm doing a trauma assessment, I am always assessing history of surgeries, of medical procedures, because even when we're not conscious, our body senses that threat, and so most medical procedures are stored in the body as traumatic. So the brain development, how does trauma impact our brain? Well, our brain develops from the bottom up, from the brain stem, the lower parts of the brain, to the top of the brain. So in other words, from the most primitive parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that handle our involuntary responses, like our fight or flight response, breathing, heart rate, body temperature, sleep patterns, these sort of reflexive involuntary things are handled by the downstairs brain. The downstairs brain is also responsible for coordination and movement, and at all stages, sensory integration, while the upstairs brain, the upper half of the brain, is really responsible for thinking and planning and organizing, impulse control, managing your behaviors, the kinds of things that your brain needs to be able to do in order to function in your occupation or in a school environment. But the development starts at the bottom. So if you think of a newborn infant, what can they do? Not much, right? It's all reflexive, because even though they have a physical brain, a fully formed physical brain, it's not wired yet. It hasn't built neural pathways and connected all the dots yet, but it happens very rapidly over the first few years that begins to happen, so it starts from the bottom up. But if a child has early childhood trauma, like in utero or during the first year, that downstairs brain becomes impacted, and it doesn't wire correctly. The neurons don't develop patterns in a healthy kind of way. And the upstairs brain development is dependent on the downstairs brain development. So what that means is, if the downstairs brain didn't properly develop, the upstairs brain cannot properly develop. This is why we get so many children that have trauma in the first 2 years of life, and then they get into healthy, happy, stable homes, and they still struggle throughout their lifespan. It's like building a house. If you don't build a strong foundation, the rest of the house isn't going to stand up. That's how the brain works. So there's hope, though, because there's so much rapid development in the brain that we call neuroplasticity. that we can reroute and rewire and rebuild a child's brain. And this neuroplasticity lasts throughout childhood up until age 18. The peak of neuroplasticity is 1.5 years. That is the most rapid brain development that a child will ever experience. Now there's another peak in the adolescent years. So if we're dealing with those difficult teenagers, as tough as they are, we have to remember that is a period of rapid brain development, and we have a chance to reshape their brains. So there's hope. But what it means is, because there's sensitive periods of development, and what that means is there's a window of opportunity for learning basic functions. There's a window of opportunity for motor development and coordination. There's a specific time and age that a child must learn that to acquire that skill. And if it's not learned, they can acquire it later, but it's harder because the brain isn't developing that function as quickly. That's what neuroplasticity is about. So a good example is language acquisition, right? How many people, just by show of hands, know a second language and speak it fluently? And keep your hand up. Put your hand down if you did not learn that language in early childhood. So at least half of you, if not more, kept your hands up. Because I took like 5.5 years of Spanish. I still can't speak it. I can sort of read it. I might be able to understand it if you're speaking very slowly, but I can't speak it fluently. Because the window of opportunity for learning language is in the early childhood years. That's where there's the most neuroplasticity to develop that ability. So I can learn it later in life, but it's much, much harder, right? So older folks, this is why it's so hard to learn new things. We just don't have the neuroplasticity in our brain, so it takes extra effort. It takes about 400 repetitions to fully develop a synapse for a new behavior. 400 times you have to practice that. 400 times in order. Some people say, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I just can't get myself to do it, because a lot of times they don't have a neural pathway for the other behavior. You have to actually practice that other behavior to begin to develop that neural pathway, and we have to consciously resist this other behavior in order to let that one atrophy. It's like a muscle, it'll weaken, and then we won't use that behavior so much. 400 repetitions, right? But there's a trick. If a child is experiencing joy while they're learning, it's 12 repetitions, right? So think about our school systems. Are kids moving their bodies while they're learning? And are they having fun? Because if they're not, learning takes so much longer. And most of our schools aren't designed for fun. They're designed for obedience, so we can teach large masses of children at one time, and they're not designed for movement, right? So it's an uphill battle. The thing to know about sensitive periods of development is there's one for just about every single function that we have, and almost all of them occur before or by age 6. So what that means is by the time a child gets into first grade, we already need more patience and more repetitions and more resources, because we got to have more effort to teach those skills, because their window of opportunity for that has already passed. This diagram shows from the brain, from the bottom up, what we're developing, right? So these are the 4 basic areas of the brain. These are the functions that are managed in those 4 basic areas of the brain. And here's what happens when we're calm versus an alarm state. So this is true for anybody. When we have something scary happen, right? We're driving to work and we almost get in a near accident. We have that little surge of panic. As we go into an alarm and maybe even a full-on fear state, our thinking capacities and our emotional regulation capacities go offline. Have you ever tried to talk sense into somebody who's really, really angry? You just can't do it, because they're not even in their upstairs brain. They can't access that. Here's what happens to people who have chronic trauma. They get stuck in vigilance and alarm, and that's where they exist all the time. You can't sleep there, because you can't get your body to rest. right? You can't really function because you can't really engage in thinking, planning, reasoning, creativity. You can't do those things. I have a sibling who, after his 3rd tour in Iraq, had some really bad PTSD, and he just had this pile of bills paying, that he just couldn't. He said to me one day, he said, I can't do anything except sit here and drink a beer. I cannot organize my thoughts enough to even manage that, because he wasn't in his upstairs brain. He couldn't get his system to regulate again. It took some years for that to happen. That's what's happened to most of our people. They're in vigilance and alarm all the time. And then it's just a hair trigger response to be in full-on fear. And when you're there, then you're just in your brainstem. That's where paranoia exists. That's where irrational thought exists. That's where we begin to experience some psychosis. It's all about just reacting to whatever we perceive as threat. The amygdala is this really important system in the brain when we're talking about trauma, because it's the alarm system in the brain. It's the part of the brain that associates experiences with threat. And when this gets triggered, the alarm goes off, sends a message into the body that says fight, flight, or freeze. Trauma triggers are often not what we think they are. We often think, well, if I bring up the memory, that's my trauma trigger. Could be. But remember, it's the body that remembers everything. And the body is remembering sensory experiences and sensations. So trauma triggers are most often smells and touches, feel on the way something feels, the temperature of a room, the season, the tone of a voice. It could be anything like that. So most people don't know that, and they don't understand what their trauma triggers are. They just know that the alarm went off in their body and they feel threatened and panicky, right? So they don't know. So if there's something associated with a trauma, let's say a long time ago a woman was walking down an alley and she was assaulted, and her assailant, her perpetrator, was wearing a certain type of cologne. And she can't tell you about that cologne. She doesn't remember it, but her body remembers it. Okay? So let's say 20 years later, she's invited to an interview for a job that she's really excited about. And she sits down in the interview, and across from her is a gentleman who happens to be wearing that same type of cologne. That sense comes in through her nose. If it hits her brain goes, danger. That alarm goes off, sends a message into her body that says fight, flight, or freeze, and she's in the middle of a panic attack, and she has no idea why. That's how trauma works. Trauma also has this way of getting stuck outside of our normal memory system. Our memory system isn't like we have a file cabinet that's all about childhood, and a file cabinet that's all about grandma, and a file cabinet that's all about school. It's actually this really complex mixture of neural networks that associate that file together based on sensation in the body that happened at the time of the experience. Okay, so the neural network clumps similarities together because our brain will condense information in a way that makes room for more information. And it will clump that together based on what our body felt like at the time of the experience. So sometimes the experience that's in that same neural network is nothing like some other experience, but the sensation that occurred in the body was like it. That's how it gets clustered together. Trauma memories and somatic memories based on trauma, because left brain shuts down, we have left, right brain. Left brain is like kind of logical, rational brain. Left brain is also the side of the brain that says, that can tell you when something happened. That was past, present, or we're going into the future. It's sequencing, right? So if I said, tell me a story about your life, you'd say, well, I was born in, and then when I was 3, and then I went to this school, and you would go through this timeline. That's your left brain sequencing. That's where normal memory storage occurs. Trauma memory gets stuck over here in right brain because we're in fear response. Left brain goes offline. Rational brain goes offline. And so it gets trapped over here, and it can't integrate. It can't make its way over and access sequencing. Okay? So the woman is in the interview. Her body senses the threat. The alarm goes off in the brain, sends a panic message into the body, which is survival-based, right? Fight, flight, or freeze. Fight your way out of this, get out of this, or protect yourself. And she can't access the part of her brain that says, hey, the thing that you're responding to is something that happened in the past. The brain can't tell the body it's about the past, so it just is experienced as the now. That's how trauma happens. And we get triggered and we're in the now, and if you're standing in front of me and I feel threatened, then by golly, it's about you. And you're a threat, and I'm gonna attack or I'm gonna avoid, right? This is the stuff that we see in our tribal programs that make it so hard to sustain good programs. Because we're responding to trauma and we're reacting to threat that it isn't about our people in front of us, it's about something in the past, but we don't know that. And when we feel like we're under threat, we build alliances, right? I'm gonna build my team over here against this team, and we start to fight, and then we start to blame and point fingers, and this is what we're doing in our communities, and we don't even realize we're reacting to trauma. These are behaviors of traumatized people. This is how the body experiences sensation. The alarm goes off, tells the brain to react, sends a sensation into the nervous system, which runs through our spine, connects out into the branches of our legs and our arms. Big cluster of it goes into the heart, which is why we feel so much sensation related to emotion in the chest area. And it branches and connects with organs. So when we have an emotion, we feel it in the body. That's what emotion is. It's a sensation in the body. So if I say, tell me what does it feel like to be sad? 100 of you would give 100 different answers. I feel it in my heart. I feel it in my chest. I feel it in my stomach. It's heavy. It's hot. It's light. It's cold. It's a sensation. If I say, what does anger feel like? You could describe that in sensations. And this is how it happens, through the messages in our nervous system. And that nervous system has a memory of its own, okay? And travels back up and forth between brain and body. Brain and body are communicating all the time. We know this as Indian people. But now we have a medical system that says if you have a mental health disorder, go to this doctor, and if you have this disorder, go to this doctor, because we're not treating people holistically. So most clinicians in the trauma field are not yet treating the body. And if we don't process out the trauma in the body, we haven't fully helped the person resolve the trauma, right? So when trauma resolution occurs, you should be able to access the trauma memory, but it shouldn't bring up all those icky sensations in the body, which is the reason that people avoid the trauma. Again, the nervous system, I want to talk about 3 basic parts of the nervous system that tell us what to do. And once the amygdala goes off in the brain, it's really your boss. When it's full on alarm, you are simply reacting, and access to real rational thought and ability to kind of think through and where you're going is lost. You become very primitive and reactive. So when the message goes into the body that there's threat, the first place that's triggered is in this upper thoracic region. And if any of you are into like chakra work, you'll understand this because it's the same thing in a different language, okay? So it triggers this upper thoracic region, which is our social engagement region. This is a part of the body that says, you're under threat, go find your safe person. Remember my little toddler that would grab my leg? His social engagement system was just activated. It's a very healthy, activating part of the nervous system. We hear stories about veterans who are in the field during a war crying out for their mommies. It's because their social engagement system was just activated. But if we're in situations where help is not available, or we tried to get help and we were ignored or dismissed or told it was our fault and nobody would listen to us, we can literally stop going to this. It like shuts down. And the next place in the body is fight or flight. This is an activating region in the nervous system that says help is not available, solve this problem in your own. Fight your way out of it or run, get out of there. That's fight or flight. But if we're in a situation where we can't escape, or we have no power because we're a child and nobody will listen to us and we have no way to get out of our abusive home, this part of the nervous system can shut down too. And then the next part of the nervous system is way deep into the pelvis, and it's the part of the nervous system that says, help is not available, you ain't getting out of this. Self-preserve. Protect yourself in any way that you can. So while the fight or flight response activates the body and increases blood pressure and increases heart rate and all of these things, this lower part of the nervous system in the pelvic region does the opposite. It tells the body to preserve as much energy as possible, and it slows down all functions. So temperature drops, heart rate drops, blood pressure drops, respiration drops. Sensation in the body diminishes or disappears. So this is also referred to as a state of shock, where people aren't experiencing pain. Guess what? As people can get stuck in fight or flight, some people get stuck here. And this is what we call freeze or collapse. And when you're stuck here, it feels like numbness. It feels like I don't exist. It feels like I can't move my body. I can't get out of bed and walk across the street to the TANF office to get the support that I need, right? These are the folks that we tend to mislabel as lazy or not caring, but they literally can't move their bodies because their nervous system is in shutdown. And actually, if you're in the medical field and you take temperature and blood pressure, you're gonna see consistently lower temperatures and blood pressures and heart rates, just a tad lower, just a tad below normal in these folks. And they're in freeze. And they're just somewhat dissociated from their body. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the attachment brain. It's a super, super important part of the brain. This is what makes us different from reptiles. It's our social brain. And the attachment is literally a system in the brain that develops to help us feel safe and secure. Not just in relationships, but inside ourselves, and we call that felt safety. So I can know logically that I'm actually safe in this room, but if I don't have this, I don't feel safe in my body. See the difference? So when we're helping people resolve trauma, we want to establish actual safety, but even more importantly is teaching them how to experience felt safety in the body. So again, lots and lots of work with the body. How does this develop? This develops when an infant cries and caregiver responds. That's simple. Baby cries and is hungry, caregiver responds and nurtures and feed. Baby cries and is dirty, caregiver responds and engages and changes. At every stage, it's not just about physical needs, it's about connection with the infant. That face-to-face, silly noises that we make with babies, lullabies that we sing, touching, actually provides the environmental stimulation for this part of the brain to develop properly. With babies can't regulate themselves, right? So this concept of let baby cry, he'll calm down. They can't, they don't have that part of the nervous system yet. So we co-regulate them. Baby cries, we pick them up. How do we soothe the baby? What do? We sing, we rock, we pat, we say it's okay, we empathize. It's all the stimulation that a baby needs in order for this brain to develop properly. And doing those things, the patting is rhythmic. The rocking is rhythmic. The music is rhythmic. The sound of the heartbeat is rhythmic, right? We're providing this rhythmic balanced stimulation that's helping the baby's nervous system to develop. And through this process of being regulated, the baby learns to regulate itself because the nervous system develops properly. Have you ever seen a caregiver, a parent who is agitated and anxious try to soothe their infant? It doesn't work, right? And you can see their nerve, and they usually have baby facing out instead of right. They're like bouncing, and baby's getting more upset, and parents getting more upset, and it's like this vicious cycle. So in order to calm an infant, we have to be calm within ourselves. It's called co-regulation. If this process does not occur, mom and dad are substance abusers and they sleep all day. And so baby's not getting nurturing, or mom and dad work all day to make ends meet. and they're not in a nurturing daycare, or mom and dad were not nurtured themselves and they just don't know how. Or maybe mom's suffering from postpartum depression and she can feed and diaper and that, but she can't engage and nurture, right? Then the attachment brain does not develop properly. Now, in the postpartum depression children, what we see is delays in speech and insecurities in attachment, but not total disruption in attachment. In children who are chronically neglected in nurturing, we see deficits in all areas that are related to functioning in life. They have no ability to self-regulate. So when they pop up into that fear response, that panic response, they can't bring themselves back down. When they're low, they can't regulate up. When they're high, they can't regulate down. There's no place in emotion that feels okay and safe for them. It all is outside of their ability to tolerate. They can't function properly in relationships. They can't make sense of themselves or other people, so they don't have resilience to stress. They can't even make sense of or meaning out of life and create relationships with other people. Outside of academics, these are all the things that we need to function in life, right? You can have a really low IQ, and if you do these well, you're gonna be okay. But if you have a really high IQ and you can't do these things, you're not gonna function in life. This is the majority of our prison population. I used to work on the sex offender wing, and one of the realizations that I had during that work was these things, for those guys, are at the same developmental level as the adolescents that I'm working with in my practice who have complex trauma. But now they're adult males with adult strength and adult power and adult sex drive, who's never received adequate intervention, and they have the capacity to hurt people. Our prison is full of these folks, and their trajectory for them is really dismal. So this is the relationship intervention that I'm talking about, being able to help people feel safe in relationships again through safe connections. And we're constantly projecting and blame and reacting to people because of our own trauma. We can't do that. We must heal self first in order to be available to help other people heal. People ask me all the time, of all of the practices of the United States government that were genocidal against Native Americans, was there one that was worse than the others? Yes. In my opinion, it was the boarding school era, because this is the thing that broke all of our connections. Not just to our relatives and our family, but to our land, to our culture, to our medicines, to our language, to our self-identity. You know, we believe that our culture is in our land because when we have a ceremony there, the energy of that ceremony is always available to heal us, right? Our ancestors are in our land. We survive off. So when we're detached from that land, that's a major disconnection for us. That's a traumatic wound. And all of those things that actually acted as buffers against trauma were removed. They were taken away. And then children were placed in a situation where they weren't nurtured, and they were shamed for being Indian and beaten for practicing their ways. Talk about complex trauma. Wow, right? And then no resources for coping. These folks came out, the ones who survive, I can only imagine, came out with so much chaos in the nervous system that they couldn't find their way back to normal functioning. And you can't, if you've ever had a panicky experience or an anxiety attack, you know how yucky that feels. You can't exist there for very long before you start to reach for something to help you self-regulate, like alcohol and drugs or some other addiction. And that's what our addiction population is doing, is they're trying to figure out how to feel like a normal person because they can't get themselves on their own. They don't know how to self-regulate. So if we're teaching and helping people heal an addiction and we're not addressing their self-regulation ability, we're not getting to the core of the problem. And we're literally just saying, hey, look, you're a bad person for using drugs and alcohol. You need to stop using the thing that makes you feel okay and then just use your willpower to get through the way that you feel. That doesn't work for any of us. My willpower only lasts about 2 weeks, right? And then it's over. So real change, again, comes from treating the body and treating the relationship trauma, because it reorganizes the nervous system and rebuilds the connections in the brain so that the person can feel safe in their body again. How many of you have heard of the Shutterbach experience, right? If you took a Psych 101 class, you know about this. So back in the 60s there was a researcher that really was trying to understand this whole concept of learned helplessness. And he studied dogs, and what he did is he took 3 groups of dogs and he built a shutter box, and you can see that it's a box that has a hurdle in the middle and there's 2 separate sides. So on one side the floor gives an electric shock, but the dog can jump over the hurdle and get to safety. Okay, so the first group of dogs was able to jump the hurdle and get to safety every time they were shocked. The second group of dogs was leashed to the electric grid side, so they couldn't jump over the hurdle. But they were given a lever, and they could learn to push the lever to stop the shock. Third group of dogs was also leashed to the electric grid side, and they were given a lever to stop the shock, but the lever didn't work. So here's what they found, is that when they released the dogs and shock them so they could escape, only one group was traumatized. And that was the group that could not escape their shock, that would try to escape, and after multiple attempts of trying, they gave up. So what happened was, when they unleashed those dogs and they shocked the dogs just laid there and didn't escape. And they would shock them again and again, and they would just lay there and not try to leave. They tried to show the dogs there was safety, to coax them over the hurdle, to bribe them over the hurdle, to carry them to safety, and the dogs wouldn't move. We now know that this is the physiological state of freeze or collapse that the dogs were stuck in. So there was some research after this trying to discover, well, when somebody's in that state, how do we get them out of that state? And they tried all these methods, and here's what they finally did. They picked the dogs up, and they moved their bodies in the action of escape, right? Because it's the action of body movement and the experience of a pleasant emotion together that create neural pathways for new behaviors more quickly. So we didn't know it then, but what we understand now is through those actions, they were beginning to develop a new synapse for a new behavior that had atrophied or that had become overwhelmed when the dogs were shocked. When a person experiences pain after pain after pain with no ability to control or escape the situation, their nervous system will ultimately become overwhelmed and they will collapse into freeze. And that's where the dogs were. This is what's called learned helplessness. And it's only through picking that person up and literally hand over hand, taking them through the movement of a new behavior that we can help them get out of that state. So what does that say in terms of our services for our people who are in this state? Right? That they need a lot more assistance probably than what we're giving them. And that saying, you need to do this, and you need to do this, and you need to do this, is not rebuilding anything for them. But taking them and helping them and showing them more than once will begin to build those new neural pathways. That means a lot more research, a lot more patience, and a different mindset about what it means to help somebody versus enable somebody. What does the research say about healing trauma? The research says that, in a nutshell, what happens to our nervous systems is that we become a state of chaos. That the normal synchronicity in our bodies that allows our body and brain to communicate so that our bodies can access brain knowledge and our brain can access body knowledge, the innate capacities that we have to know how to be Indian, right? Indian knowledge, what our traditions are about, our spiritual knowledge, our ancestral knowledge, how to nurture, how to be healthy. If we're in a state of chaos, we can't access them. They're there. We just can't find our way to them. What resynchronizes the nervous system? Connections. Safe, consistent, stable relationships. That's one of our biggest values, right? Rhythmic, bilateral movement and sound. Bilateral means both sides of the body and both sides of the brain, right? You move your right side of the body, it stimulates left brain and vice versa. That is the stuff of our ceremonies. It's the stuff of our music, it's the stuff of our dances. It's how we lived our life. Rhythm was a part of who we were and how we existed, right? If you could take a bird's eye view of a clanship in the old ways, there was a rhythm to the way that we lived. There was a rhythm to the day and the way that we moved and what we did. We weren't rigid, we weren't linear, but we were rhythmic. And those rhythms coincided with the seasons and the earth and the universe, and we were always trying to work to be in rhythm with everything. And so not only, we weren't just going to healing practice, we lived our lives in a way that restored our bodies on a daily basis. And then when we experienced unwellness, we would go to somebody who could tell us how to restore our nervous system, how to regain health by drinking a certain tea, eating a certain plant, right? There's minerals in our earth that help restore our cells and help calm our cells down. We don't walk around on the earth anymore. We don't put our hands in the dirt. If we have dirt on our body, we wash it off. We don't live this way. But our people knew that was where health was. That connection was where health was, right? So I'm going to end real quick with telling a story. If you heard me speak last time, you heard the story, but I'm going to tell it again. Many years ago, before I became a trauma specialist, an elder of mine told me a story about how trauma was healed in our culture. And I didn't know the significance of this story till many, many years later. But what he said to me is, we had traumatic experiences in our old ways. There were traumatic things that happened. But we didn't have trauma disorders because we knew how to heal that. And here's how we did it. So the example he used was if a warrior went out on a war party or to steal a horse or something like that, and a traumatic thing happened to that warrior, he would come back to the clanship and he would go in front of his group of people, his clan, and he would retell the story. And so there we have a cognitive process and a verbalization, right? Those are two components of trauma healing, to be able to tell the narrative, right? Because if I say, I'm feeling sad, actually naming my emotion begins to help restore my system. So to be able to tell the story in front of others. And then somebody who saw that happen would stand up and say, I saw it and what he said was true. Atonement. Truth value. And during this whole process, as he was describing it, he would be going through the actions of what happened to the rhythmic music and ceremony and prayer that was being held, right? So this is where some of our powwow dances come from. So there we have somatic processing and bilateral movement and rhythmic sound. All the elements, as we know today, of trauma processing. And then the clan would say, okay, we take this event as a significant event in our clan's history and for this person as truth. And perhaps the warrior's name would be changed to reflect the event. Perhaps his wife would paint the story on the outside of the lodge or the teepee. The horse or the shield may be painted to reflect it. So it gave meaning and purpose to the traumatic event. Those are the last two elements of trauma healing that were already present in that ceremony. Every single tribal community I go to and I tell that story, they say, we have a practice just like that. And here's how we did it. I have yet to be to a tribal community that doesn't know how to do this, right? It's there and it's effective. And we have always known it. Now we just have the science that validates it for the rest of the world. My dear friend David Cross, David, are you here yet? He's supposed to be here to me today, today. But recently he said, when we were doing a project with a tribe, he said, he's a non-Native person, he said, we're teaching some trauma strategies to this tribe, and he said, I need you to heal your trauma for you. But more than that, I need you to do this for me. And what he was saying is, your tribal people have knowledge that our non-Native people need to get ourselves better. You need to teach this to us too, so that we can be well. Thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate your attention.